Angelo Romano on EC relations with the Soviet bloc in the 70s, long 70s, and then Diego Scarabelli, University College of London, on the American project for an anti-missile shield and its impact on relationship with European integration. Andrew.
So it took 30 years for the European community to get recognition from the Soviet Union and the communist European countries. Nonetheless, despite the unexistence of official relations, the two European powers had not been ignoring all along. And despite official policy, there had actually growing unofficial relations, at least since the early 70s and all along the decade, I will argue. This essay looks over such unofficial relations between the community on the one side and the Soviet bloc countries on the other side, considering the EC as such, so the community. I will not canvas in this particular essay foreign and economic policies of the member states, not on the specific individual member states, nor in their, let's say, bargaining process within the European community. So I would take the actor as a single entity, the community as such. However, it is worthy to remind that the EC decisions came out from a complex process of internal bargaining among member states and institutions. The choice to focus on the 70s is due to the fact that several factors, both political and economic, combined at the beginning of the decade and lasted all along in promoting the willingness of the EC and the communist bloc countries to try and develop contacts, but for quite different reasons and goals. In the first part, I shall analyze the political and economic rationales of the actors and their goals, and also the conflicting interests. In the second part of the essay, I will very briefly report on these unofficial contexts of a various nature, and in the conclusion, I shall debate some scholarly interpretation of reasons for the official relations to be eventually just after 15 years, even though there were enough contacts. So for the political and economic rationales, we know, it's really covered and relevant, that the Soviet Union and the communist countries of Europe have been against the integration processes since its very beginning, arguing in a very ideological fashion that it was a capitalistic bloc, that was basically the economic arm of NATO, even some sort, perhaps later, as an instrument of neo-colonialism. Sure, it was a source of commercial discrimination as far as these countries were concerned. As a consequence, none of the members of the Commonwealth group had recognized the community. But since the end of the 60s, several factors combined in creating a favorable atmosphere and favorable conditions to the development of contacts between the community as such and communist countries of Europe. And I would particularly highlight two factors of a political nature. The first relates to the flourishing of detente between the two superpowers and between Western and Eastern European states. So if the Cold Warriors at first could tone down their rhetoric and even accept the existence of different systems and even more sign agreements in several fields, it was reasonable to expect a change in communist countries' attitude towards the community. The second factor at play is the relaunch of the integration process itself at the Summit of The Hague in 1969. The so-called ambitious triptych of the enlargement, deepening, and completion, was also cited by the creation of the European political cooperation, so the intergovernmental instrument or mechanism outside the EC framework, but in a way linked to it, that would help the EC member states to harmonize and try to harmonize their foreign policies and to try and speak with a single voice in the international arena. The relaunch of the Hague is particularly important in bringing the topic of relations with communist Europe at the EC level, at the importance as a subject important in the EC debate. Why? Because the deepening process meant the creation of new common policies. At first, the common commercial policy and then the fishery common policy, and it meant that the Commission, specifically the community, but more specifically the Commission, was the only entity entitled to negotiate and sign agreements in this field. So commercial trade agreements between communist countries and individual Western European countries would not be any longer possible. Second, precisely the creation of the European political cooperation mechanism and the goal of speaking with a single voice definitely put the question of this anachronistic situation of having half of the continent and the entire second world not recognized in the community. So if you really want to propose yourself as an international actor, you really might wish to have the other side of the continent to recognize your existence and competence. So it came really to the front of the EC debate. On the other side, there were these two political factors also made some changes in the perception and images and consideration of the European community in quite conflicting ways. As for the Soviet allies, I don't really like using the term Soviet bloc, especially in the 70s. There were considerable differences and interesting, intriguing attempts to play, to walk national paths. So as for the Soviet allies, the political attitudes vary considerably from hardliner position of Bulgaria and the GDR notably, to a more encouraging approach towards recognizing the community of Poland, Hungary and Romania, which also favored means of losing bloc ties and enjoying a certain degree of autonomy from Moscow. So they basically endorsed the spirit of detente and wanted to play their own national policy of detente in some way. However, it is clear that the decision of recognizing the community as such could not have come from the superpower in first instance. And as for the Soviet Union, on the one hand, the EC deepening process, its enlargement, and even the political cooperation increased hostile reactions. It was even worse. But on the other side, it was even worse because, of course, a strengthened, more united Western Europe could exert a stronger appeal on neutral countries and on satellites, let's say, from the Soviet Union. And it was particularly the case during the period of detente, because the process of detente itself engendered some centrifugal tendencies within each bloc. On the other hand, the Soviet foreign policy and Brezhnev himself were particularly engaged in promoting detente for completely different goals, or peaceful coexistence as they prefer to call it, of which the recognition of existing realities in Europe, whatever reality, was the major goal. So the Soviet leaders had a quite ambiguous approach towards the issue of recognizing the community and had to strike the right balance between supporting the detente and maintaining control over the communist communist bloc, especially after the Soviet split and the challenge, at least ideological, that China was launching to the Soviet leadership at the global level in the communist world. Besides political rationales, economic interests also played an important role in shaping the attitude of the actors, for better or worse. The persistent slowdown of the economic performance of state trading systems vis-à-vis the rapid growth and prosperity of EC countries had made and encouraged the communist countries to revive East-West cooperation and trade, as well as, let's say, reviving interest or rising very high interest in getting access to Western financial sources, credits, and technology. Together with the opening to international trade in general, the West in general, came a more conciliatory attitude towards the community. Because the community represented a worthy economic partner that could certainly no longer be ignored, especially if equipped with a common commercial policy. However, the appraisal of the economic consequences and the consequent relevance of the economic factor in determining the political choice towards recognizing the community and which kind of relations to establish differed sensibly between the European states, communist states on the one side, and the Soviet Union on the other. The East European countries had an urgent need to gain better access to the EC market. They had already suffered export limitation as a consequence of the creation of the Common Agricultural Policy, really severe limitations, and could only envisage a worse situation with the implementation of the Common Commercial and then Common Fishery Policy. Most of the countries export towards the community confront with the EC highest protection tariffs, being precisely the sectors most worst affected in the EC economy. So it was definitely necessary for Western European countries to protect their producers. Not only did the East European countries need to avoid further erosion of their exports, but they also vitally needed to rise them, actually, because exports towards Western Europe were an important means to gain the hard currency to pay for imports. And imports were the key factor in modernizing the economy of the communist countries. So it was a vicious circle. And it was the base of the economic growth and even stability, and it was also growing an important factor in keeping the political stability, as it was shown in many upheavals, especially in Poland. The economic growth was a key condition without which the stability of the communist regime in Eastern Europe were seriously endangered. As for the Soviet Union, well, imports from the West were lower in percentage, so still important from the qualitative point of view. They mostly consisted of food and technology likely to fill the existing gap in production. But what is more important and what differentiated the Soviet Union from its allies is on the side of exports. Actually, 9/10 of Soviet exports towards the common market consisted of oil, natural gas, and other raw materials, to which the community applied neither tariffs nor quotas. So the Soviet Union had no urgency at all to seek concessions from the community as such. It could definitely negotiate whatever was needed with member states according to the existing competence. Consequently, political rationales, not economic rationales and goals, prevailed in the Soviet policy towards the community. And since the Kremlin was not in a position of demander, it could negotiate the recognition quite tough. Finally, economic factors or rationales did not seem to play an important role for the community either. The community exports, common market area exports to Eastern Europe amounted at near 2%, and it was becoming evident that, well, the common market was not a dynamic one, so it was not interesting or was not a target or possible boom of export. The only interest the community had in negotiating with common countries related to improving the access, actually, of Western producers and exporters to the market, and that meant easing the bureaucracy requirements, access to more accurate statistics, isn't it 20 minutes? Oh.
5 minutes to go.
Statistics, etc. So, but these matters could actually be negotiated in multilateral framework, and for the rest, the topic of cooperation agreements were of competence of national member states. So the community as such had really no economic interest in opening relations or seeking for official relations. These positions, so these were the encouraging factors one way or another, but the positions were in the end not reconcilable because of the political nature of the two key actors, the Soviet Union, the political nature of the interest. The two key actors, the Soviet Union on one side and the economic community on the other side. And the political issue was at stake was that the Soviet Union wanted the community to establish relations with the common, but not with the single individual countries. That was explicitly excluded. And the European community wanted exactly the opposite. It claimed it was natural, technically feasible, and economically more advantageous to establish relations between the community and each single country, and side, possibly, these agreements with an agreement between the two organizations. But that had to go in parallel, it was not exclusion. So this is the reason for 15 years of mutual distrust and encouraging contacts and negotiations on very specific issues. It was a lack of political, let's say, consensus between the two big actors on the kind of relationship to be established. And I argue that this is particularly related to the Cold War bigger image, because the goal of the Soviet Union was to secure its bloc and to establish relations to let the community establish relations with each individual countries could only help the loosening of the bloc. And already in the economic, from the economic point of view, actually the communist European countries enjoyed a lot of autonomy. So to add this factor would have only, let's say, worsened the condition and made Moscow lose the grade. On the other side, the community and the member states wanted to establish individual bilateral relations with each communist country, also because they wanted to promote a loosening of bloc ties. They wanted to make the Iron Curtain more porous. They didn't want to help Moscow to strengthen its control over its allies. On the opposite, they wanted to overcome the Cold War structure. So despite the several contexts which grew more and more within the LCP process, but more specifically bilateral between the community and several countries, which led to formal agreements, sectoral agreements with several countries, the official recognition still was impossible to achieve. Some scholars have argued against, blamed the community for taking a too aggressive stance towards the issue, arguing that at the same time the community had recognized other organizations, such as the Southeast Asian Organization, had relations with the League of Arab States, and did not want to recognize the Commonwealth and have relations with the Commonwealth just for ideological and Cold War style positions. This was not true. This is not convincing to me, because if you go through the documents and the discussions between the sides, the Commission representatives always stressed the fact that they were ready to sign agreements of possible and impossible subjects with Commonwealth, but this should go hand in hand with bilateral agreements with individual countries. So it was not, let's say, a very aggressive stance. And in the end, the community, and this is the final point, the community's strategy actually gained, because when within the Soviet nomenclature and the elite, the situation, the mind changed, notably when Gorbachev came in a position of leadership, the Soviet Union accepted to let individual countries sign agreements and recognize the community, and then the common community agreement would be signed as well.
Thank you, Angela.
This is the first proposal that ever came they were not united in their answer and in talking to the United States. They replied that through an intergovernmental level. For example, the UK said no because it was not going to gain any military technology. West Germany said no at the beginning, then said yes because it believed that it was going to receive monetary aid and also military technology as well. Then when it discovered that it was not going to share the technology with the United States, it said no again. France said no from the beginning because they don't like the United States too much, but that is been proven before. But what is important to see in this period, in these 8 years, from 81 to 89, Reagan was going forward with this treaty, with this proposal. He always wanted to build a ship, probably in West Germany. However, the member states of the European community did not reply in a common way. They said no, but in different ways and for different reasons. The following president, George H.W. Bush, changed the plan. He did not want to build anymore an anti-missile shield on the European soil. He simply wanted to create a small-scale defense system, but nothing too important and nothing that actually scared the Soviet Union and at that point Russia. From 1993 to 2001 we had the Clinton administration that once more cuts the fund to this project and remove any possible American base from that would have led to the construction of this shield in the European Union. It moved everything to the United States. The European states did not have any issue coming from that. They didn't have any problems with Russia in this period. However, France put forward the idea to create a nuclear umbrella to protect the European states in case of war. The famous 1995 nuclear tests that were conducted by France with also the consensus of the United Kingdom, simply because the United Kingdom was actually going to share the results from these nuclear tests. The other European states, particularly Germany, to this proposal did not agree. This proposal was coming from an EU state. It would have brought further integration. However, nobody wanted to join simply because there was no economic benefit, no geopolitical benefit. Most of all, the benefits were actually in the French hands because France was going to be in control of the nuclear weapons anyway. We have another American proposal always for this anti-missile shield with George W. Bush. So between 2001 and 2009. The proposal is very similar to the one of Reagan. Of course, the technology has improved. Now it seems more reliable. It seems that it could actually work. The idea this time is not to protect Europe from a nuclear attack coming from Russia, but it's actually the idea is to protect from the rogue states. According to the US, the rogue states are North Korea and Iran. This time, the European states, at least the three big states, so Germany, UK, and France, were united in saying no. And they said no directly to the United States in a common way, not like with Reagan that they were disunited. They immediately said no and they did not agree. The threat came from Poland. Poland at the time, in 2001, was not a EU state, but it was already an applicant and it was going to become an EU state in a few years. However, the geopolitical needs of Poland required an anti-missile shield. I don't speak too much about the Czech Republic that was actually going to host a nuclear base as well, because it was not really a nuclear base, it was simply a radar. So it was not as important as the base that was going to be built in Poland. What is important during the George W. Bush administration is that we can see that there is a difference between how the four countries behave. With Reagan, they were disunited and they had the same reasons, but they behaved at an intergovernmental level. Instead, with George W. Bush, they were united and they had a common front and they refused the anti-missile shield. However, through the enlargement, Poland behaved on its own. This is important also to understand that the CFSP that was newly born did not protect Poland, at least in its eyes. Russia was still seen as a threat. Russia was still dangerous, even though there is actually a statement from Chirac that said the Polish government for once could have shut up. So it really shows actually how it's very strong from Paris, but it shows how the integration, at least on the defense level, was always between the big countries, the big three. A few years before, in 1999, there was the San Malo conference between the UK and France. And France wanted to continue on this level, but we saw this didn't happen because the new country, Poland, wanted to be the first ally of the US. So the last period is from 2009 to nowadays, with Obama. George W. Bush prepared everything for the shield. It was going to be built. All the project was ready. The next president should have simply implemented. This did not happen. Obama did not agree with the plan. He decided to make mobile bases under the American control through the American Navy. So it was not on a European territory anymore. Therefore, my research does not deny the fact that the United States could be trying to have a policy of divide et impera with the European allies. This is not the case. What I'm simply saying is that first, there is not a direct causality between the foreign policy, and especially the defense policy, of the United States and what the European countries do. And second, even the several theories and scholars argue that the anti-missile shield can be considered as a Trojan horse that was created by the American government to destroy the military alliances among the European countries. Again, this is not the case. Europe was divided before, after, and during these proposals. It has, the research simply shows that the argument that Europe, for its defense, is simply relying on the US has to be undermined, because this is not the case. The countries believe on a realist approach and on an intergovernmental level, either through the EU when it's useful, or with the United States when they can receive more gains and benefits.
Okay. I would start from the last paper, in the sense that I see in this paper a couple of very interesting points, and it also at the same time a sort of disjointure with the way in which historians approach this. In the sense that you state at certain points in your paper, the conclusion of your paper is that you somehow expect coherent reactions over time to the same issues. And if you are going to build a model or theory, obviously you have to reason in those terms. And I think it comes clear to an audience that is by and large historians, if I'm not mistaken, and certainly in my case, that we operate on an opposite assumption. I would expect, as a historian, I would expect responses to vary, not only according to national interest, or some conception of regional interest when that is the case, but above all, to vary in relation to other strategic and policy goals, or even industrial policy, or defense economics goals that each state can have. And these strategic aims or goals do change over time. And in particular, it seems to me that I wouldn't really know how to do your job, and I think it's a big challenge. I don't
it seems rather obvious to me, again from a historian point of view, that the strategic goals, expectations, priorities for these European states were intrinsically and radically different before 1989 and after 1989. Because when you mention why France, Britain, and Germany separately and with different argumentations rejected the plan in the 1980s, at the same time, I think that each of us start thinking that at the time they were arguing with the United States on a vast horizon of issues that basically converge on one path of European thinking, that was preserving the ties with Eastern Europe and therefore with the Soviet is paramount to any other initiative that the Reagan administrations might push, and certainly the anti-missile shield would be highly destabilizing of any possible at the time. So that would, to me, explain their reactions in the 1980s, why it does not help explain reactions after 1989, when the whole game is obviously changed. The post-Cold War is a different scenario with diverse assessments of primary strategic needs, and in that respect, again, it's not surprising, it fits, I think, your modern implementations more neatly. Note that those who had primary interest not only in reasserting some sort of self-defense position in the Soviet Union, but also to cement a deep strategic relationship with the West at home, wants to do, probably will want to do, is bound to differ from France or Germany, really have much less intensive, let's say, defense needs on either side, as well as the differentiation in the way in which each country assess the real and presumed threat of Iran, which most of the Western nations, as you mentioned in your paper, did not consider Iran a major threat. So context matters a lot, and in this respect, my experience tells me that sort of dialogue between political science approaches and historical approaches is always welcome, but in the end very rarely realized, because we don't only start from different premises, but often aim at different type of narrative construction. But this being said, I think that your case is that the shield was not a Trojan horse for the West power in Europe. Is a very well made case. Actually, one would very well argue the opposite. There was one way in which US power was actually diminished in Europe, especially during the Bush Jr. administration, that backfired in many ways, as well as the argument that member states are in charge of their own decisions as far as defense and security, not only actual policy, just broad reasoning is concerned. That's obviously a very sound argument. One might wonder a larger question, that is, if that is sort of collateral to your story, whether overall reliance on NATO and transatlantic security arrangements somehow retarded and hampered the emergence of the European defense identity, which clearly many member states see as more costly, politically as well as economically, industrially, and so on, as reliable, or perhaps simply unnecessary. But this is sort of a bigger, larger stories that both historians and political scientists grapple with without much success so far, that would require much larger analysis, not just the shield, which is your focus. The other three papers, it seems to me, have a few things in common, at the very least because they deal not exclusively in the case of Giuliano, with the Soviet work, with Eastern European countries, and obviously Yugoslavia, that is the non-capitalist part of Europe, and they bring to the foreground some acquisitions of historiography and some serious research problems. The serious research problem seems to me that cuts across these paper, perhaps less in your case, in the case of Yugoslavia, but also in the case of the Soviet, is that we still have to reconstruct Eastern European governments and Soviet attitudes, their debates and their choices, not from their own records, but from British records, European Community records, French, American, whatever. Which is a problem because these records sometimes are accurate. They reflect conversations, they reflect analysis by Western analysts that might be accurate, but might also be wildly wrong. But by and large, they tell us what the Soviets wanted to tell to the Canadians, for instance, which is far different from what they discussed among themselves. So we can construct a rather large picture, like Angela does, quite accurately, I think. We still have some difficulties in getting into not simply the details, but the evolution, the change of the internal debate. For instance, we have little, if any, notion of something that instead is present in your paper, that is the different positions within the regimes. You know, that no doubt there were in the Soviet regime as well, even more so in the case of Poland or Hungary, perhaps even the DDR, but we are basically in the dark about this. This is a huge implication, because it makes these accounts not entirely reliable, sometimes complete in their sort of external contours. So the problem is there, but it's a big problem. Still, what we can see in Soviet moves, especially as we counted in the sort of longer term like Angela, are the basic tenets as well as the basic tension of their view of detente, what detente implied, cooperating with the West and or maintaining control of their own bloc. In the case of the Soviet top of the pyramid, of course, opening up, but at the same time maintaining good relations with the Soviet master. In the case of the other governments, this is something that cuts across the entire period. Which makes me think that one of the things we might do in the future is try to understand if they did not actually evaluate the power of attraction of the European community and the European community countries, so if you want Western capitalism, more promptly than we ourselves did. Perhaps not because they had great power of analysis. The Soviet leadership in the 1970s is not particularly sharp and acute, but they certainly have a much more keener sensitivity to the fragility of their own bloc, their own system. They have long antennas on that, the security apparatuses. And so we have a few cases that are studied fairly well about that. They are how the Stasi analyzed the incoming Helsinki conference, and they were quite aware of the dangers involved, even though they overstated their ability to control these dangers. So it would be very interesting to build up a sort of parallel story of how much Western leaders thought that they might loosen the Eastern Bloc, while at the same time Eastern leaders thought either that a loosening would be very welcome in the case of satellite governments, or terribly threatening in the case of the Soviets, and comparing these two views and their evolution over time seems to be one of the tasks we could very well entertain in the future as a research agenda. I found also very, very interesting, very convincing in the written paper here, the presentation obviously we detailed them through less clearly, but the intertwining of different economic and political interests between Eastern Europeans and the Soviet, as well as the counterpart, the community is quite illuminated. I totally agree that the EC attitude eventually was successful. It's fairly obvious. One might wonder whether it could have been more successful earlier on, but that's remained a highly hypothetical question. Perhaps what would be interesting at this point is to this issue is to refine and, if possible, modulate the analysis that we've heard here in terms of the changes, especially in Soviet attitudes, more than the satellites, with the evolution, or if you prefer, the rise and decline of the time. In the sense that the Soviets had a much more optimistic attitude from their point of view in terms of evaluating their own strengths and the weaknesses of the West in the first half of the 70s. How do they deal with these issues? Are these issues affected by the incoming realization not only that the tent is going to the dogs and that they have to accept a much more conflictual relationship, certainly with the United States, but probably with the West, and you know, when sort of a less confident, if not pessimistic attitude by the Soviets starts to kick in, whether this affected their approach to the European community or not, or whether they revalue their approach to the European community in Western Europe as a sort of counterbalance to the deterioration of their time with the West. This is something that, again, I doubt that without Soviet or Eastern European archives we can do very well, and it's a second question that seems to be worth asking. As well as reading your paper, I was wondering whether, if they come to a realization that some of the elements of the economic relationship established with the West, and particularly the growing level of debt, as was becoming unsustainable, when did they realize that? It's fairly clear in the Polish crisis in 1981, the Soviets think about intervening, not intervening, how to intervene in the Polish crisis, that at that point it has dawned on them. The Polish debt is so huge that even we cannot take it upon ourselves. So maybe from 78 to 1981, 82, 83, there is a moment when a few of the elements of the very complex equations that you have described might start to change in terms of perception. It would be interesting to be able to go deeper into that. I don't know if we can. Julius Bentivoglio's focus is more circumscribed around the moment of British accession. It's I think, a useful lens, because enlargement obviously forces the Soviets, and especially, I would say, the Americans, to focus on what they really think of the EC, what they expect from the EC, what they want, what they do not want, what they fear, etc. But here the problem of sources seems very, very serious, in the sense that known availability of Soviet sources is macroscopic in this case. It's very clear that they say to the Brits what they want the Brits to hear and what they think. But I also think that if you want to expand this work, to go on with this work, a sort of thorough work in American sources is necessary. Because it's striking that we are in a moment in which the entire setting of the transatlantic relationship is shifting and changing in an uncontrolled and unpredictable way, in which everyone is very uncertain about the fact that there are at least 5, if not 10 grounds that intersect with each other, their own mobile and from the monetary issue to the oil, whatever. At the same time, in this conversation between the Brits and the Americans, the American position comes through as terribly sclerotic. I cannot think of any other term. I mean, the debate between the economic ministries on the one hand, Treasury, Department of Agriculture, that say our interests are affected, or our allies' interests, allies in America as well, are affected by enlargement, while the State Department on the political side of the administration say there are larger strategic policy reasons for desiring a stronger, more self-confident community, in this case with Britain, is exactly word by word and people by people what they were saying in 1956-57 when they discussed the Commonwealth. So it's a bit surreal, that 15 years later, in a completely different context, when the Americans have a variety of issues and problems and difficulties with Europe, as well as with everything else, we are still listening to the same perspective. In this sense, we do not go deep into the American sources and see not only how they debate internally, but how they link, for instance, the issue of presenting or not the European community, the larger European community, with transatlantic monetary issue, with issues about support for other Western transatlantic policies or not, makes, I mean, your lens useful, but within so narrow the topics. Finally, on even over the paper, I think it's, to begin with, very, very welcome, because I, too, have never encountered an analysis of Yugoslavia and the AC. So as a first, it's always very, very welcome. I don't know if you know more of this literature, but I have never seen it. So, great. And great also because here again, we see something that is similar or is comparable, and a lot of things that are very different from other countries in Eastern Europe. There is an element, again, in the paper, you go into details about this in the written paper when you have time to read it, because also the Yugoslav leadership has a dilemma similar to the Soviet one, even though in different times, that getting into deeper agreements with Europe and European integration means a trade-off between perhaps diplomatic and economic opportunities and chances, but also dangers in terms of domestic control, or less ability to control the dynamic of the domestic economy and so on. And it's interesting that this happened even in completely different sense as far as the international position of Yugoslavia is. Because Yugoslavia is, as you said, in many ways supported by the West, by the Eastern Bloc, etc., etc. So I don't have anything to add really to your account of Yugoslavia's position and predicaments. I just sort of welcome it, and I think we should digest it and think about it. Your paper made me wonder, though, on the only side that I know slightly better, is what you think of the EC's attitude towards Yugoslavia. Or not only the EC, but the major Western governments. Because, and a supplement to this, if you have from your sources, what did the Yugoslav leadership and authorities think about their interlocutors in different moments in time? In this sense, above all, from our point of view, that given the strategic interest that West had in Yugoslavia, which was clear and was shared between the Americans and the Western Europeans, perhaps the Western Europeans even more once the tent kicks in. Given the fact that there were very dense economic trade relations, migration relations, in the case of Germany, for instance, with Yugoslavia from the early mid-60s onwards, right? One wonders, reading this paper, could not Western Europeans and the communities itself have been much more forthcoming, much more available to write agreements, offering more. You mentioned rightly the discussion the Yugoslav had about the fact that there were so clear economic asymmetries between the two, and the Yugoslav had a lot to lose from some easy policies, or from getting into a deeper agreement with them because they were on a different scale of technological advancement, different type of production, etc., etc. But these asymmetries are obviously, they matter a lot for a relatively small economy like Yugoslavia, obviously matter much less for a larger economy like the European community. So the European community, given the strategic interest in Yugoslavia, given the strategic interest in promoting the times, why not give more? Why not give more? Were they so concentrated on the Eastern Bloc in the 1970s, Yugoslavia was just a sideshow? It's a possibility, I don't know. Were there differences between different European governments? With perhaps, I don't know, Germany or Italy giving more importance, other governments giving less importance? We don't know, but it would be interesting to to explore. But still the question is why this lack of incentives, given, again, the asymmetry was little cost to Europe, Yugoslavia, economic as well as political incentives to go further. And here I conclude, in this paper, as in Angela's, as well as in many other instances, we, seems to me, bump into a wall that is very well known to everybody that studies the European Union, lives in the European Union. At a certain point, domestic interest, internal interest of the European Union hamper, damage, prevent foreign policy, prevent expansion of foreign policy influence. We know this for the global south in many respects. I wonder whether we could do a slight step forward. That is, there is nothing peculiar about this. This happens in the United States. Every American debate is a debate between national economic interest, trade interest, and strategic interest that might sort of be overall overwhelming, or they might be set aside. It's the same case for every power, small or big, on earth. The difference is, it seems to me, that in the case of the European community/union, we are talking, when we're talking about the common agricultural policies, the common tariff, not simply the domestic interest, but of the very residential community. This is the community. This is the community compromise per se. So to go against these policies, not only to sacrifice some domestic lobbies to a foreign policy interest, as is the case in any American debate, but is to call into question the very center of gravity of the community itself, the act, not the real act of union. And therefore, should we still consider that in an analogy with the American case is simply domestic interest vis-a-vis foreign interest, or is this not the identity, because by identity we mean something else, but the essence of the community, and therefore something that is non-negotiable, to use a popular term these days. It seems to me that we should go into this, because it seems to me it's a qualitative difference that the community has vis-a-vis any other foreign policy actor. This being said, unfinished, the floor is open. I don't know how much time we have. I believe it. No? 15 minutes, right? Okay. Cristina, Brian, Itochi. And, sorry, I don't know your name. Okay. Oh, yeah, Itochi, yeah, just time for me when we move.
Non va?
Okay. Okay. No?
Abbiamo cambiato le...
Ecco. No.
Yes, no, yes.
Grazie. One question to Angela. Well, you came to Japan as fellow in February. This is a continuing discussion, and it's about looking into the 70s. That probably the 70s could be the origin of the EC or today's EU having a global view or global strategy. And that we're trying to look into the origins, which seems an origin, of that sort of global view. So my question is, so what kind of evidence could we find, for instance, in the Commission's files or the minutes of the Council of Ministers? Because it was difficult for me, at least, to find, in the case of Japanese trade war, to actually find the words global or more widening external views, etc. There was not really clear signs of those. But then, being typically Japanese, I didn't trust the other Japanese. But going back to my country and looking into archives of foreign ministries, the word global suddenly appears in the Japanese side. And Japan only had trade agreements with the United States. But as soon as we found out that we need agreement with the EC, suddenly the term global comes, that this is a global problem.
that we need a global solution. So, at least from Japanese... sorry?
When is that?
During the 70s, after the first oil crisis and the conflict became very furious just because the economy is going down, suddenly the term global pops up like that. That any trade agreement with the United States and Japan should be expanded to the Europeans, and that was called global. In some sense, Japan is still subordinate to the Americans, saying that we have this deal, so using this to the Europeans means global. That's a little bit too much simplified. And we're never clear about what terms we're using, but at least that was clear on the Japanese side. So I was wondering, what kind of evidence could we find in the Commission files of actually the external views of the Europeans, be it the national government or the European Commission, could we find? Because you were mentioning this relation with Comic-Con, that it was only 2% of export, which doesn't matter as a statistic, but that was the same case as Japan, because Japanese export in Europe only occupied like less than 4% or something. It suddenly increased to 8%, but that's still not much an amount. But it was not the amount, it was the meaning which had the importance. So that was a common, that EC wants relations with Comic-Con, relations with Japan was also seen as a problem, but it was not the amount. It was about what this is about. I mean, that was where the important was. So that was the point which I wanted to see. So in what terms could we find this sort of global view emerging in the Commission? At what levels? Who, like Sir Christian Solm's file, in the Japanese case, it was very important. He was in charge of trade. So that's my one question. Thank you.
So Julian, I'm going to ask you a very global, general, maybe superficial question. And then, of course, an expert in that once read that this special relationship between UK and United States was actually more special to one than to the other. So, in principle, for the UK, it would be fundamental. It would be part of its identity, so it would be more important for the one. But for the other, it would be more instrumental. The Americans would emphasize it when they need it, when they find it more convenient. So I wanted to know to what extent do you think it's actually like that? Which are the implications and how this is manifested as well? And then for the other, I don't know if you have explored the relationship between Euroscepticism and the willingness to build this shield. I remember when I was researching about this enlargement, that I was conducting interviews, and many people told me that one of the reasons, it was a minor reason, it was one of the fundamental ones for promoting enlargement, was this idea of preventing Central and Eastern European countries from becoming a new kind of American colony, of becoming Americanized. You know? So I thought that this could be an interesting factor for this relationship between Euroscepticism, especially after accession, and this willingness to support the shield project. And also very short question, which is also the relationship between the countries which have bases, American bases, and the statutes for the creation of these bases. I don't know, especially for the new ones, was there a clause stating that the possibility of building a shield would be part of a negotiation to install a base in the country, something like that? So, yeah.
Thank you. Brian?
All very interesting and informative presentations. I'm just going to ask two bullet point questions real quick. I'm curious where you think Ron's sociopolitique plays into I'm sorry.
Brand's politique?
Yeah, how it plays into the perceptions from the Eastern countries of these trade deals and
regarding the Yugoslavia policy towards the European communities, I would put the question to Ivan. To what extent was the process of Yugoslav attitude towards European integration a logical question, and to what extent it was pragmatic policy oriented to more economic question. And the second question for Diego, how you comment harsh Russian opposition in anti-missile shield, and what do you think, why plans for the common defense system with Russia failed?
Okay, just a question to Giuliano concerning foreign policy coordination in the EC, and how was this considered on the American and Soviet side in relation to the British accession? And if you have seen any discussion in the British material on what were the British ambitions for participating in that cooperation?
Okay, back to
most important point for once inside the community, and even during the negotiations in the 70s. Basically, it was seen as a sort of last chance to regain a new international role on this changed international scenario. And in British documents, I found a sentence more or less is, if we can't lead, and if we don't take this chance, we want success to gain a new impetus in the political arena anymore. So it was definitely fundamental. And so Christina, the special relationship, how much time do we have? Let's start from the point. The expression special relationship was created by the British. It was created. And it's a sort of British concept. It would be very hard to hear an American, especially since the Second World War, talking about special relationship. The United States were rather they have many special relationships, not only with Britain, but for instance with Israel, with Canada, with Mexico, and so on. And yes, it's true, when they advocate and they invoke this sort of ghost of a special relationship, yeah, they often demand a favor from the British era. But we also should make a distinction on what we intend for special relations. If these relations is special in intentions, and in that case, yes, only for the British side, mainly. And or whether this relation is special in practice, in everyday conduct of policy, and this is a matter of fact. Then we could open a very huge parenthesis and ask ourselves whether the special relationship continue to be special even in this period of the early 70s or even after the during Britain's European choice. Very briefly, I can tell you my view that is, it's not true that this is the period of the nadir of the lower side of the special relationship, as it's usually been depicted by historiography. The choice of Brussels didn't mean, avoiding Washington. So it was not either Brussels or Washington. Within this period, especially the conservative governments who brought Britain into Europe, pursued a double policy, a European policy and an Atlantic policy. Atlanticism was very important even in this period. And probably we would say that it was less special in this sense. And was maybe more particular. Anyway,
Okay, so first I'll answer to Andre. Yes, definitely it was a question of, it was an ideological question, and I think maybe I should state that more clearly in my paper that Tito was not prepared to, of course, to abandon the communist model, communist ideology, and therefore the integration into Western Europe was actually not the solution to Yugoslavia. Therefore they decided, they opted for the third world countries that they wanted to do. What about the Western policy? I consider that the EC and in the 1970s they were definitely not forthcoming to Yugoslav needs and economical problems. But I think that the 1980 cooperation agreement actually gave a lot of beneficiaries to Yugoslavia. But at that point, the problem was that Yugoslav economy was in such bad shape that it actually could not. It didn't matter. Yeah, it was in a way it was too late. Yeah, and what about the Western policy? Actually, I did previously research on British policy toward Yugoslavia from 1968 to 1974. was actually quite an important period in Yugoslav history because in 1971 serious political crisis broke out in Yugoslavia. It was called the Croatian Spring. And I made my research on the British documents, which were then revealed on the Foreign Office documents. And I considered that the British policy at that time was what to do with Yugoslavia, how to achieve the internal stability of Yugoslavia. Because in 1968, actually, it showed that still there is a threat of Soviets, so there is still an external threat to Yugoslavia, which was very important to us. But 1971 showed that actually there is also internal threat, international question, which they considered that it was actually solved. And the Yugoslav communists always said that we solved the national question, which was obviously not the truth. So I think that Tito's death in 1980 also gave another impetus to the Western policy, and therefore they probably wanted to the efficiency of the cooperation agreement. But as there was no result in the late 1980s, Professor Vlahovic from Yale University has written a book which will be published this year. And I think that he rightly claimed that, like in 1987, 1988, the EC officials, the Western politicians in their conversations said, well, we have given so much to Yugoslavia, they didn't use it. They didn't, and what was also very important is that from the mid-1980s there was East-West relaxation of tensions. So actually from the mid-1980s the Yugoslav position to the West was not so much important, and it was actually less and less important as this advanced further. So I consider that I didn't write this in my paper, but this was actually very important in 1989-1990. Because at that time, Ante Markovic, the reformist prime minister, federal prime minister, needed financial assistance from the West. And he didn't get it in 1990, but he got it only in 1995, in June. And then it was too late for it. So Vlahovic argues that this was a missed opportunity from the West. So that's about the Western policy, in short.
Very good, Mr.
I may add, as far as I have seen, just passing through documents, the position about Yugoslavia gained momentum, the debate about Yugoslavia gained momentum in the second half of the 70s when basically all Western governments started to worry about after Tito. They were incredibly stressed by the possibility that the Soviets would actually eventually get Yugoslavia back in some way, and of internal disruption.
If I can just say, there are also documents from the US from 1950s, which also says that what will happen when Tito goes.
Yeah.
They considered in 1953, 1954, 1955, they considered that there is a great possibility that Yugoslavia will turn to the Soviets. So they were really afraid of that option. But in later they actually considered they were more concerned also with the internal stability and the national question. I wanted to say that.
That's interesting. Okay, so very quickly on sources, yeah, that's a problem. I guess the secondary sources are quite useful, especially when you deal with, let's say, the economic debate within communist countries. And the 70s is such a great moment for this debate for national reforms and for the reform Comecon in itself, that there is a vast literature of scholars dealing with each particular country, and that I found particularly useful. Because even if you possess the language, which I personally do not, it doesn't mean that you can get access to archives, so especially for the Soviet Union. So that's a real problem. But I wouldn't renounce to, let's say, think broader. We cannot stick to seeing the documents. The evaluation of Western capitalism, yeah, I got the impression that specifically some Eastern European countries were particularly well equipped to analyze Western capitalism, even the beginning of change, if not perhaps crisis, not at the moment, but they perceive some changes and they analyze it very accurately because there were consequences for their national program of reform and growth, which was in the 70s totally massively linked to import of technology from the West in order to fulfill the gap. As for, absolutely your invitation to think about the Soviet attitudes linked to the ups and downs of detente is a key question, and I am now considering late 70s, beginning of the 80s. My impression is that it is more, up to now, it is more a counterbalance. Because actually 78, 89, 81, which is the worst, well, when the superpowers relation get worse, is perhaps the more public, the more overt moment for the relation between the Soviet bloc and the community and member states. The negotiations between the community and the Commonwealth were public in 78. They were secrets, they were unofficial, and in 78 they are overt negotiations. And there is the gas pipeline affairs, which is 1980, which is completely makes the American crazy about the link. So I guess it's seriously the time between the superpowers is one thing and the time in Europe is another. It was pretty going good in that way. So I would argue in the sense of counterbalance, but I'm not that's sure enough. And to Hitoshi, if I get your question right, the evidence of sources, I didn't find actually the keyword global, but was most the international role or role in the world. And all the documents I consulted, as for the Commission specifically, a bit less for the Council, divided actually the policy or the future policy of the community for the international role on external relations in three keys, very schematically, very precisely. Industrialized world, communist or state-trading countries, and third world. So in the 70s there was this self-perception, self-image of going global, even though that language was not that specific word, was more the words, the first, the second, and the third, and how the community could develop a consistent policy towards each of the world.
Because I think in the 60s, the Commission. Sorry to interrupt.
No.
Because the Kennedy era during the 60s, it seems that the Commission was less ready.
Yes.
That it was a passive, saying no to any proposal.
Yes.
But then in the 70s, the Commission was proposing, so that's more not passive but active. So
yeah, you're right.
Your point is right that it started to categorize it. That's
and perhaps was a good lesson learned. We weren't ready, so we have to take care of it and think about it consistently. And Brandt's-Politik, I guess we can talk about that at the dinner. But, my personal view, I said I couldn't treat the member states' policies. But my personal view is that basically the EC endorsed completely the Ostpolitik philosophy and approach. So if that might be an answer.
So, according to the different laws for 89 and after, it's totally correct. For sure, the threat posed by the Soviet Union is not comparable to the threat posed by North Korea or Iran. Not arguing about that, I'm simply arguing and trying to study according to the anti-nuclear movement, no, I did not take that into account because it's also useful to suggest I should take it into account. As I said before, I simply took into account the government level. In that case particularly, I didn't take it into account simply because it's more a defense proposal more than an offensive one. So I didn't really consider the citizens in that way to say like we don't want it because I simply believe it was more about defense than all. However, I think your idea should be added to yours as well, and take the population into account for sure it's going to increase the spectrum of analysis. When it comes to Russia and the proposition against the missile shield, well, I don't think that we should make a paper simply about Russia in this case, how Russia behaved in this manner. I can say that through the 80s, the Soviet Union did not want the shield. It was clearly against it. So later on, George W. Bush again also perceived that as a threat to its sovereignty. So it did not want the shield again, but this time it proposed to build the shield with the United States in Azerbaijan. So they were going to manage it together and work together to that. This proposal was not actually taken into account by the US, but it was taken into account by the European states. If you ask me why the CFSP failed, there are many reasons. If we take into account simply the anti-missile shield, and we take into account Poland and why Poland was so scared of a maybe Russian invasion, well, we can actually say that the CFSP after 1999, it has no tools. The reaction forces of the European Union can become up to 60,000 people. Ground soldiers that could last between 2 months active, and then they would maybe last 1 year. However, the Western European Union, that should be the military arm of the EU, does not have the organization at the time, but nowadays still, or even the power to counterattack a country of the size of Russia. Most of the time, actually, the EU is always asking for help to the NATO. So I would say that Poland prepared an alliance with the United States because it felt much more protected, while on the other hand, the European Union, at least in military terms, is not ready, is not prepared. And if we even take into account what happened in 2001, 2002, the Leikam Island problem, when some troops from Morocco made the little island next to Morocco, but that belonged to Spain, the EU wasn't able to do anything. The Prodi Commission actually said that you should retreat, but the French presence and non its colonial matters, so we should not intervene. So the fears of the Poles are well, we can really understand. In that case, somebody acted, and it was Spanish soil, and it was better to the country that just joined the EU.
Thank you. So we are at the end of this session. Hope you find it interesting as I did. I think we need some marching orders from Sala.
I think this first day is over. It's been long and tiring, but I'll be successful. We can meet for dinner at 10 to 8 at the Foresteria from Rodrigues. Do you know where the restaurant is?
Yeah, because mine is coming to it.
Yeah, okay, so no problem. Then we'll meet you there at 8.
Okay, and tomorrow morning we restart, for those who are not coming to dinner, at 9:30?
9:30.
9:30 here. Okay, good.